Hello and welcome to the Walrus Leadership Forum on Life Sciences. I'm Jennifer Hollett. I am the Executive Director of the Walrus, and we are pleased to be joining you today online in conversation. It is World AIDS Day, and the theme this year is End Inequalities, End AIDS. As we reflect on the impact and ongoing challenges of HIV/AIDS, it's important that we come together today for this conversation on the future of Canada's life sciences sector. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that I'm on. I'm in Toronto, Ontario. You might hear some of the sounds of downtown in the background, to Toronto. A land acknowledgement helps us recognize history and to think about how it informs where we are now and what changes can be made going forward in a commitment to reconciliation. Our offices and where I am right now downtown, we are located within the bounds of Treaty 13, signed with Mississaugas of the Credit. This land is also the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And Toronto is home to a diverse group of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We're honored to contribute to a tradition of storytelling and welcome you to reflect on the land that you're on, wherever you're joining us from today. As part of the ongoing work of reconciliation, we encourage you to read the 94 calls to action recommended by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A bit more about the Walrus. The Walrus started 18 years ago, really as an optimistic project to tell stories and foster conversation across Canada. And we do this in a number of different ways through our fact-based journalism, which is available in print or cover story, virtual healthcare, but also online at thewalrus.ca, through our podcast, The Conversation Piece, and in public event series like this one. And this work is powered by our donors, supporters, and partners. So thank you all for being here with us. We are a registered charity, so the support of our sponsors is crucial in convening. And we're really pleased to be partnering with Innovative Medicines Canada on this event. 20 months into the pandemic, it's been a long one. The future of the life sciences sector in Canada has been on the minds of so many Canadians more than it ever has been before. And many issues have come to the forefront. This includes domestic vaccine development and manufacturing capacity, procurement, policy around public and private sector roles, the economy, and of course, addressing barriers to healthcare access. So where does the life sciences sector go from here? And what will it look like when the next public health challenge comes along? I don't even like to think about that, but we know there are similar challenges ahead. Today, we've brought together Canadian leaders in business, economics, and life sciences to share their thoughts. To begin, we'll have a conversation, a discussion between David Simmonds from Great West Lifeco in Canada Life. He's SVP, Office of CEO, Corporate Initiatives, and Pamela Fralick, President of Innovative Medicines Canada. Then following their conversation, we'll have a panel discussion and Q&A so we can go deeper into the issues. I'm really pleased to welcome right now to the Zoom stage, David Simmonds and Pamela Fralick. How are you? Nice to see you both.
Hi, Jennifer. Great to be here.
Really nice to be here. Pamela, Jennifer's gone. It's just you and me now.
Great. I'm looking forward to the conversation, David.
Very much so. It's good to see you virtually. I haven't seen you in person in a few years, and hopefully we'll be able to connect live soon.
Crossed fingers.
Yeah, your sector will be a key part of that. Pamela, the last time you were on the Walrus Leadership Forum on healthcare, it was with Andre Picard. It was in April of 2021. And that was the beginning of the vaccine rollout in earnest. I think we were grappling with uncertainty, with lockdowns. It's been 7 months later. Has your mind shifted in where we are? How's your perspective evolved, if at all, in the last few months?
Yeah, and some times of our lives, 7 months feels like nothing, and other times it feels like a lifetime. At that session, Andre and I covered some really interesting topics. We talked about the relationship between industry and government, talked about an open letter we had just signed with 17 other organizations urging the federal government to establish the pan-Canadian life sciences strategy we're talking about here. We also talked about increasing biomanufacturing capacity and and maybe some policies that could help increase investment in Canada via the global industry that I'm representing. So here we are 7 months later, and I would have to say things have changed. Never enough for me, but definitely the needle is moving. So a couple of examples. We know now most of us are vaccinated. Canada is a great role model in that regard, so that's fantastic. We've seen that policies are changing. So some of the government policies that were put into play during the pandemic are actually making their way into day-to-day approval processes. That's going to enhance all of our ability to access medicines a little more easily. So fantastic change. In terms of a life science strategy, we've seen change as well. It's mainly focused at the moment on pandemic preparedness, but there definitely seems to be, in my view, an openness to creating that end-to-end life sciences strategy that we're hoping for. There's also a greater connection between some of the federal departments we don't always see, ISED, Industry, Science, Economic Development, and Health Canada. They seem to be working more collaboratively on this. It's part of that whole of government approach we're really advocating for. And I'd also say beyond those pieces, there's some great opportunities in the future that if we look down the road and maybe even right in front of us. Jennifer just mentioned about health systems resilience. I think that's something that we're really talking about now. Let's face it, we were not prepared for this pandemic. We hate to think about the next one, but we're working now towards better preparedness. So I think that's a real bright spot. Sustainability, always going to be an issue. But one of the things that I would cite is that there are new payment models that we can explore that will really help governments to manage their budgets and, most importantly, help patients get medicines faster. We talk a lot now about performance or value-based agreements. David, you and I talked about that a little bit in prep for the call. There's amortization models as well. There's subscription models. This is where the payer would pay a set amount for unlimited patient access to a specific product over a period of time. There's package models, a little more holistic. These could include data infrastructure, testing, patient support, and portfolio models where you might, as a payer, purchase a range of products that might be more appropriate for hospitals, regional health authorities. But lots of options for us to consider, and I think an increasing openness to look at those. We've got lots of new therapies and technologies coming down, cell and gene, regenerative medicine, all the applications for AI, artificial intelligence, radiopharmaceuticals, all to benefit all of us in Canada, patients in particular. And maybe I'd end with the bright spot of new openness to collaboration and partnership. I mean, this has been one of those, you hate to talk about in a sense, but silver linings of the pandemic where relationships have really been built. It's a bit tentative, I would say, but very real. So, notwithstanding this current very serious concern we have about the new variant, Omicron, and there are some clear obstacles specific to Canada to really embracing that life sciences sector or strategy that we want. But there's room for optimism.
I think that's a really important message as we look down the road in the next couple of months, that optimism is important and it's guiding a lot of activity in the life sciences sector, I'm sure. When you think about the future state, you mentioned that we weren't as prepared as you may have hoped to have been at the outset of this pandemic. Describe that future state for Canada specifically from a life sciences perspective.
Giving me all the easy questions. Thanks, David. There is so much to say, so little time. But clearly, I'd start with that actionable national strategy that's going to build a substantive, a growth-oriented life sciences sector. And I keep coming back to this theme, but enhancing patients' access to innovative new medicines. That's first and foremost. And let's learn from where there are successful examples. I mean, right here at home, we have Quebec, the only province that has had a life sciences strategy for a few years. They're currently reviewing that in preparation for the next iteration. I know the Life Sciences Ontario has produced a roadmap of what we might do. And outside of Canada, we can look towards the UK, Denmark. These may not be cut and paste models that are perfect for Canada, but we have lots where we can learn. We don't have to invent things right from scratch. So what does that mean? What's the vision, I guess, as you're asking that question? Well, we need we need to fund world-class science, basic clinical. That's a prerequisite. Data is going to be a theme in my comments today, I suspect, from the questions you're asking. Data optimization. I mean, what do we have? What do we need? How do we modernize? How do we digitize? How do we connect all of the data pieces that are so important, and of course, all within privacy expectations of Canadians. We can look at accelerating investment in domestic biomanufacturing, and the federal government has had a couple of real successes in that regard, but it's the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that can be done, I believe. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that optimizing a regulatory environment is really critical. We have to be able to balance in Canada the fact that we have safe and affordable medicines. That's important, but we also need to attract viable business that creates jobs and investments. So there is a new regulatory regime coming into play in a few weeks on January 1st. It's created uncertainty for the global industry for years now, and it has already led to some pretty significant and negative impacts for Canadians, and particularly around that access to innovative drugs. So we just need to find a better and a more balanced way forward. It's not the topic or the focus for today, but we really think that's possible, by the way. There's a way to get to that point. But beyond the optimal regulatory environment, let's expand access to capital that fosters innovation. And what about our people? Support talent growth. It's such a huge problem right across industry these days. And I'd have to say, let's support the innovative pharmaceutical industry in Canada. It is just one part of the life sciences continuum, but it's a pretty important part, I think. If you look at StatsCan data, it contributes about $15 billion a year in economic activity, 100,000 full-time jobs, $2 billion annually in research and development. And that's just the pharmaceutical side of things. And there's a bit of an economic focus today's session. So I'll also just mention, if you look at life sciences writ large, and just in Ontario, one province, 51% of all of Canada's R&D spending is on the life sciences, from the life sciences sector in Ontario. It contributes $58 billion to Ontario's GDP, employs about 90,000 really highly skilled workers, employees across about 6,000 companies. So this is not an insignificant contribution to both the health and the economic well-being of Ontario and the country. So just to wrap up, we've got some gaps. We need to look at a few things as we move forward. Let's acknowledge, that whole of government approach is needed. Let's dedicate ourselves to really effective working partnerships between governments, industry, always using that optimal patient outcome as the driver. Let's support the predictable regulatory environment, Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. There's a better way forward than what has been proposed. Let's find that and do it. Commit to faster access to new medicines. Let's agree to use integrated data, real-world evidence for decision-making. Look at new reimbursement models. So lots of things that we can do yet going forward.
You've given us a lot to chew on there, Pamela, and I'm going to save some of unpacking that for the panel. And I'm going to ask you, we've got a few minutes left in the opening, and ask you two questions. The first is really focused on Canada's differentiated capability in life sciences. So you've worked in global markets, I've worked in global markets. Everyone has a value. So if you were to sort of zero in for the audience today and say, we should be really proud of this. This is our superpower in Canada Life Sciences. What does that sound like or look like?
Yeah, that's the good news, isn't it? That we may have some gaps and things that we need to do, but we have excellent building blocks. We have great academic research. We have AI excellence, artificial intelligence. Look at Quebec and Ontario. We have Yoshua Bengio, the head of MILA, Montreal Institute for Learning Algorithms. He's an international rock star in AI. We have a lot of innovative excellence to draw upon. Just look at the pandemic alone. The co-founder of mRNA, Canadian, the lipid nanoparticles that are used to deliver mRNA from Acuitas Therapeutics in Vancouver, plant-based vaccines that are coming to the forefront, Medicago, a Canadian company. So lots there. High quality clinical trials. They're going down a little bit because of the uncertainty in the regulatory environment, but 4,500 going on in Canada at any given time. So a real attraction for this country. The talent and expertise we have, that recent history of collaboration, I think will serve us well. We have a universal health system we might like to complain about from time to time, but it's well recognized. And we have, I have to say, a passionate, innovative pharmaceutical industry. And I'll end with that informed, vocal patient advocate community that is so essential to challenge us on every day.
Very good. So last question before we welcome the other panelist. If this was a critical path, we have no limitations. We're we're building out this life sciences strategy? What are the first 2 or 3 things that you think we need to do in order to get it done?
Yeah, so I'm going to be that broken record on the theme of let's get a strategy in place. We might not do everything within it immediately, but having a strategy gives us the roadmap. It also sends a really strong signal to the rest of the world. And in my world, the global pharmaceutical industry, decisions on investing, launching products, clinical trials are made at that global level. If we're strategically well positioned, that allows us to fight for those investments to come to Canada. So that's number one. I would say number 2, let's look at research funding deficits where we've fallen out of the top 30. Let's set an objective, maybe top 10, top 5 in OECD. I think that's reasonable. And let's make sure that we've got the right regulatory environment in this country. That is at the federal side, not provincial, where we really have that balance between looking at the industry as a cost center versus the value that it can bring to the whole health system. So let's get that regulatory balance at play.
Excellent.
There's more I could say, by the way. There's more, but I'm trying to
give us one more then. Give us one more then. Go ahead.
Well, I actually just wanted to speak to what the industry can do, because that really is pointing the finger at governments federally and provincially. And I think, as I've mentioned, we know sustainability is an issue, but we have policy solutions that can help. If we can get to various tables and talk about rare disease and data infrastructure, real world evidence, biomanufacturing, filling insurance gaps, these are things where this industry is used to dealing with crises. It's nimble. It has global experience to draw upon. Let's use some of that. We want to bring that forward. And do we want to do so in partnership? So these are things that industry can contribute to this next phase of prioritization as well.
Wonderful. Well, Pamela, thank you for those introductory comments. I enjoyed some of them. I can see various questions and comments in the chat as well as on social. So I think Jennifer's going to join us to transition to the panel.
Great. Thanks very much, David. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, David. Yes, we are excited to welcome audience members from all over. Let's see, looking across the country here, we have people registered from Victoria, Edmonton, Brampton, Charlottetown, and beyond. We encourage you to share this experience on social media, take a picture, let us know how you're watching this forum, but also feel free to live tweet or share some of your favorite insights. Comments and questions are coming in. It's not too late. Feel free to submit a question for our panel discussion. You can do so in the chat or comment section if you're watching on Facebook Live, and we'll try to get as many answered as possible. Great. Now I'd like to introduce our panel to dive deeper into some of the issues we've just heard about. So welcoming to the Zoom stage, and when I mention your name, you can just turn on your camera. We'll start with Dr. Mostafa Askari, Chief Economist at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. Nice to see you. We also have Kathy Megyery, Vice President, Policy, Quebec at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Welcome. And Gordon McCauley, President and CEO of Megyery Bioinnovations. And of course, welcome back to our moderator, David Simmonds. I'm now going to turn over to you, David.
Thanks, Jennifer, and welcome to our 3 panelists. I'm sure we're going to have a very exciting and engaged conversation today, because this topic is top of mind for all of us as we're meeting virtually instead of in person at somewhere in the country. Maybe, Kathy, I can start with you. We hear a lot about the life sciences industry and biomanufacturing. What does that actually mean, and what's the value of it to Canadians?
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for having me on this very timely panel. So I think, as Pamela highlighted, it's clear that the pandemic has exposed a lot of the fragility of our healthcare systems. But at the same time, it's demonstrated the central role that the life science sector plays in terms of health, but to your question, in terms of economic well-being. And it is clear it's a sector that's a very important creator of wealth and jobs. Pamela highlighted some numbers for Ontario. 50% of Canada's R&D spending. I mean, that's very important. It's a sector that contributes some 60 billion to Ontario's GDP. That makes it the number 11 highest contributor before some very important sectors. And it employs 90,000 people, as Pamela mentioned, but which makes Ontario the fourth highest ranking American jurisdiction in terms of life sciences employment. Pamela also highlighted that she was talking a lot about pharmaceuticals. There's, of course, the medical technology sector, which is a very important component as well. So just want to highlight that in terms of pharma, Canada is the 10th largest market globally, and it's the 8th in terms of the medtech space. More specifically, for pharma, Canada accounts for 2.1% share of the global market, and it's been growing at a compound rate of about 5%. So clearly a very important economic stimulator. In terms of just the manufacturing portion, the employment is at over $31,000. It's been growing also. And as Pamela pointed out, we are expecting and seeing investments in this sector. So those jobs will be expected also to increase in the coming years. And then finally, I'd like to say a few words about the medical device market, which is estimated at around $9 billion in 2019, which accounts to close to 2% of the global market. And I think what we saw is that the prominence of digital health in the form of telehealth or remote monitoring technologies was really magnified by the pandemic. And this will likely rise, given that consumers, patients have really appreciated the convenience that these technologies bring. So to conclude, while the pandemic has highlighted the importance of life sciences, it has also exposed some gaps, notably in our capacity to produce drugs and vaccines. And therefore, going forward, the federal government should continue to invest in the sector. Accelerating investments in a robust R&D infrastructure should include boosting clinical trial capacity, supporting the commercialization of biopharmaceutical technology, and enabling an agile biomanufacturing infrastructure. And this will continue to build the sector and continue to make it stronger. Thank you.
Kathy, thank you for those remarks. Mostafa, I might bring you in here and challenge us a little bit. So, I have a great affection for the life sciences industry, spent a long time there, and now adjacent in insurance. I think we've heard over the last 3 decades that life sciences is a pillar of our economic, success. We heard that in Quebec in the 80s. We heard that in the 90s in Ontario. We're hearing that now with the discovery or the collaboration around mRNA in Canada. We hear a lot of advanced vaccine manufacturing. Is it safe to say, does the data follow the story that innovation, health policy, and the economy come together as economic drivers in this country? Is that something we should be trumpeting the way that we are, or is that a little bit romantic?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Innovation and research and development are the basis of improving economic opportunities, and what we as economists normally call is the productivity, and then productivity increases people's welfare and well-being increases. So it's definitely important for all the sectors, but I mean, certainly life science, the pandemic showed us that we have some issues, we have some gaps, and those have to be considered, and for future policy, government policies, and how the government will allocate its spending in those areas.
Thank you. But maybe Kathy, back to you, or Gordon, let me ask you this question. How can we increase capacity in Canada? So Kathy's given us visibility to where we sit in sort of the size and scale of the global industry. Is there an opportunity to increase capacity? Should that be something that we're leaning into?
I guess it depends what you mean by capacity. I think the thing that is extraordinarily exciting about this industry today is that, frankly, it has never been better. Canada has always punched above its weight in terms of the research infrastructure and the output of that research infrastructure. On any sort of metric you want to choose, we continue to generate considerably more than our relative population weight would suggest. What we haven't always done is translated that into a sustainable industry, but frankly, it has, as I said, never been better than the last 2 years. It's one of the things that the pandemic has taught us is that if we work together in the way that a lot of colleagues around this virtual table have talked about, then we can actually do really important things. And if we think about the potential of the industry holistically, and we think about investments in biomanufacturing and investments in basic research at the same time, if we think about all of the continuum along the drug development or the device development process, we can actually generate a very substantive industry. The thing that I find, what's the right word? Sobering, I guess, is that this is by no means the only health crisis we've experienced. Health crises have been going on for a long time. I mean, we're gathered here virtually on World AIDS Day, and for those of us who've been touched personally by HIV and AIDS, we understand what a crisis that was. And let's remember that, and in some respects continues to be, but let's remember that it was Canadian innovation in a significant way that contributed to really turning HIV and AIDS into a bit of a chronic disease rather than the way it felt in the earliest days of the crisis. The difference in the pandemic is that we're all involved, right? And it touches literally every part of society, and we can't ignore it. So it's forced us to work together effectively, and I think the future is very bright if we continue to harness the spirit of working together collaboratively.
So, Gordon, I appreciate your comments, and I also appreciate you and Jennifer's acknowledgements that today is World AIDS Day, and a sobering reminder of the fact that we've lived through a number of different pandemics that have discriminated in their impact.
Exactly.
A lot of effects. I think, when we think about this pandemic, and it's the fact that it's been so agnostic to geography, to class. Well, not really. There's been class inflections in this pandemic. We need to be candid. It gives me pause, and I think it gives a number of Canadians pause. One of the responses that I think has been powerful, in you three living in the life sciences sector currently probably see the good and the bad of this. One of the most beautiful things about Canada is our federation, and one of the most challenging things about Canada from a policy implementation is our federal arrangement. I think you could make the case there's been a whole of government approach to solving for COVID-19 in Canada, and we've seen benefits of that approach. How do we take the best of that response? Because there have been some bumps along the way. How do we take the best of that response and extend it into this new challenge of trying to build capacity or drive innovation or build an ecosystem here in Canada? Is that possible? What are the bright spots there? That's open to anyone.
If I can just say a couple of words. As I mentioned, certainly the pandemic showed us that we have some gaps in certain areas, and the government obviously needs to take that into account in their future policies. But the pandemic also caused a lot of constraints for all levels of government. We have gone through a period of 2 years with unprecedented spending by the government, which had to be done. There was no really other option but to help people to survive during that period. So that has caused significant amount of fiscal constraint and strain for all levels of government. And even though they need to look at the different industries and how we can make investment that would deal with some of the problems that we faced during the pandemic, definitely health problems and vaccination and those kind of things. But at the same time, the government also face a huge constraint on the fiscal side. How would they sort of provide a sort of priority list that would actually help the life science industry at the same time other priorities that that all governments have. And so I agree with your statement that our federation is great, but our federation also is a huge challenge because politically we have seen it for many, many, many years. It's very hard to do that kind of a collaboration that you were talking about in general. Now, the pandemic showed differently because everybody, I think there was no other choice. But for other issues, for other policies, you have a challenge, definitely, among our provinces and the federal government.
Yeah, I guess if I just jump in there and say, I agree with what Mostafa is saying, I would also say that there's an opportunity to continue with that with that goodwill and taking advantage of each other's efforts. Our business is very active in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, and we see the provincial governments in each of those jurisdictions being really proactive in what they want to do, and being proactive in trying to augment or amplify what the federal government's investments can do. I had the opportunity to participate in an announcement in Charlottetown at BioVectra a few weeks ago. And again, the provincial government made a big bet there alongside the federal government. So look, the politics is always going to be there. There's nothing you can do about it. It's the beauty and the misery of a democracy. But at the end of the day, I think there's really a desire to treat this industry as really the industry of the future that's creating the kind of jobs that we want to have long term, and is an opportunity to export Canadian knowledge and generate Canadian wealth.
And if I could just add to that, I do think one of the positives that has come out of this is, the federal government has formulated a life sciences strategy, and we've seen that in Quebec. When the governments put out a strategy, things tend to happen. So I think it's a positive because we recognize that we need to improve our security and our autonomy in terms of biomanufacturing for ourselves, but also to be able to support other countries around the world who need these vaccines and treatments. And beyond the current crisis, it will strengthen Canada's capacity with promising new therapies, cancer, genetic, and other therapies, and again, reinforce us. So having this strategy, ensuring that it does get deployed and rolled out and in collaboration with provinces and territories, to me is a positive.
Yeah, and if I can just add on that too, I mean, one of the things that Pam talked about was the sort of frustration sometimes between levels of government and the frustration about regimes and how effectively they were listening. One of the things I find kind of passively amusing is that many of us had the opportunity to participate in a biomanufacturing consultation process that the federal government and some of the provinces engaged in earlier this year. And candidly, the vast majority of people in the ecosystem thought it was a sham process. They thought that the policymakers knew what they wanted to do. And look, one of the things that's really fascinating is that if you participate in those roundtables, they were actually listening, not just the federal government, the provincial governments. And it's, again, one of the perverse benefits of the pandemic is that it's caused policymakers to say, we really need this industry and we really need to listen. And the kinds of investments being rolled out in biomanufacturing are a direct reflection of the input that was made in those roundtables. So personally, I find it kind of exciting.
Thanks, Gordon. Hey, Kathy, I want to just double click on something that you mentioned around investment. How do we scale investment in life sciences? Because we benefit, again, from being the neighbor to the United States, but it's also a massively outsized market in comparison to the Canadian market. So what advice do you have, or thoughts or insights can you offer in the appetite to scale here in Canada?
Yeah, so I would probably focus in on 4 areas, and I apologize if there are some redundancies with what different people have said. I mean, I guess there's we've been thinking about these things and having conversations. So, perhaps we've picked up ideas and ideas around a number of things. But, clearly we talked about it. We need to develop a robust Canadian life sciences R&D infrastructure. I mean, I mentioned this before, but we need to sustain the investments that have begun during the pandemic, namely in manufacturing. The second, and Pamela highlighted this, is that we really need to improve access to innovative medicines and vaccines. Canada lags behind most OECD countries in the adoption of innovative medicines, and that's really due to the multi-layered and sequential drug review and public reimbursement processes. And the federal government really has a key role in facilitating faster time to market for health technology. So that's the second. The third is a national electronic health data system. We really need that. And, this was acknowledged yesterday or the day before by the Pan-Canadian Health Data Strategy Expert Advisory Group that really recommended a federal electronic health record platform. So that would be the third. And the fourth is really around life sciences talent, and investing in life sciences talent is absolutely critical to address the shortage of STEM skills and to work with innovators to identify future needs. And I believe, again, it was this week that it was announced that there'd be a dedicated House Standing Committee on Science and Research, and all parties agreed for the need on this. And that's a huge step, because the programs that are currently in place to encourage higher level studies really need to be modernized. So those would be the four components that I think, we need to work on in order to be competitive and interesting.
Thanks, Kathy. We do have some time for audience questions. If there are audience questions, please enter them, and we will sort through and try to offer some of those to the panel. Gord, I don't want to lose the chance to ask you. We're talking a lot about the infrastructure around life sciences, the policy frameworks that we need. What about talent? Do we have the right talent in Canada? There's a discussion around, a war on talent, or people moving around. Talk to me a little bit about that, given the seat you have.
Yeah, it's absolutely a huge issue, as it is in every industry. It's one of the peculiar things as the world tries to figure out how to recover from this pandemic. It is a huge issue for us. As somebody who has been in this space for 20 plus years, and typically, if you're talking to biotech CEOs or investors, which is my day-to-day life, you used to hear about capital being the number one problem. Investment capital has responded kind of nicely. There's never enough. It's responded kind of nicely. Absolutely. The number one or two issue across the country is talent or space. And it depends on the specific circumstance. And the interesting thing is, I agree entirely with what Kathy's saying. Looking at long-term at how to encourage and increase the number of participants in STEM areas. But there are also lots of things we can do in the near term. We just struck an alliance with a group called CASL, the Canadian Alliance for Skills Training in Life Sciences, which is bringing to Canada the global gold standard in biomanufacturing training. And what's great about that is that it looks at reskilling, which is obviously something that a lot of governments, particularly provincial governments, are concerned about to help build the biomanufacturing groups. Upskilling, training people further, and that new skilling that Kathy's talking about. So it's a huge issue, and I think we need to look at domestic opportunities like the CASL program. I think we also have to look at immigration, because that is clearly a driver for talent in this space.
Sorry, can I just ask, Gordon, your talent, the shortage that you were talking about, or the challenge, is it a global issue or just a Canadian issue?
It's a global issue. Absolutely. As an aside, one of the benefits of all of us figuring out how to work in a virtual world is that it's relieved some of the pressure points that we historically have had around highly specialized skills that might not actually exist in this marketplace, and they can work more remotely and visit. But that is a small relief relative to the broader talent challenge. It's absolutely a huge issue.
So let me ask a selfish question. I spent a lot of time in the healthcare supply chain industry, and we would often hear asked for funding, and we would challenge our partners and say, I don't know that we need more funding. We need to spend the money we have more strategically, or in spaces where we can really drive value. There's a question from the audience challenging all of us to say, where do we get the money from? We would take it from somewhere else to give it to health sciences or life sciences. Is that the case you're making, or is the case you're making you want more strategic investment or more thoughtful spend? Maybe, Mostafa, we can start with you and then go to Kathy.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I think this is always an issue for policymakers. And how do we allocate? What are the trade-offs? How do we do that? And that depends on many things. It depends on politics. It depends on the priorities of the government in place, that their ideology, the way that they look at different things. I mean, I think the question is a relevant question. When we increase the spending in some area, the government has two choices, or actually three choices. They can reallocate money from somewhere else, which somebody else is going to get hurt. They can raise taxes to get that money, or they can borrow money. I mean, every one of those has some issues with it. I mean, the government has been borrowing significant amount of money during the pandemic, and people are concerned about it, and rightly so. But government had no choice during that period. But again, raising taxes is perhaps a solution in some areas for some levels of government, but it's a difficult thing to do by governments that they like to get reelected, and taxes always are something that people don't like to see. So, but that's a choice. That's a choice that governments have to make. One of the things that we have always said we know that the healthcare system in general has some issues in Canada, and provinces are hurting because it's a huge part of their budget, and they have affordability issues for their healthcare system. But they do have an option to raise taxes, but it's a difficult thing to do. So I mean, this is always a challenge.
I would look at it also from a slightly different angle. I would really look at it in terms of avoided costs. I think what we've seen during the pandemic is because we didn't have the infrastructures and the resources in place. One, we overloaded our hospital systems, and we're going to be paying a huge cost for that in the future. The economy came to a halt again because we were simply not able to keep people working and productive. And we are going to deal with a huge backlog in terms of diagnostics and in terms of surgeries, and people, who will suffer from that backlog. So in my mind, you have to look at it much more in terms of what these investments will avoid in the future, as opposed to looking at them as an additional cost that the government has to find somewhere else.
Yeah, and I'd only add two things, because I agree with both Kathy and Mostafa. I would point out that a number of the comments that Kathy made earlier, that Pamela made earlier, were about making our existing processes and systems more efficient, particularly around some of the data issues. I think that's critically important, and obviously all of us, just as taxpayers, would advocate for that. The second thing I'd add is, Mostafa is 100% right. Governing is about choices. You have to make choices. One of the things that we would encourage actually is for government to continue to make very specific strategic choices. And again, one of the things we've seen through the pandemic is a willingness to do that, using, for example, the Strategic Innovation Fund in very strategic ways. And we've seen provincial governments do that as well. And I think that's the kind of thing we should continue to do. Politics sometimes frustrates that process and makes it difficult to do. But to me, the data are overwhelmingly clear that investments in these areas pay off from a public policy perspective, unquestionably. So we need to continue to make them in very focused, strategic ways.
These are very good insights. Two questions coming out of the audience, and I'm paraphrasing, so I apologize to audience members for taking liberty with your words. One of them is around innovation from a technology perspective and how that can accelerate change. So, 5-10 years ago, we kept hearing that we would never want to see a healthcare delivered virtually. Access to health information couldn't be delivered virtually. And I, like many of you, are moving through the country with my COVID app or my vaccine verification record, which is my health information now on my phone, visible to restaurant owners and shopping mall attendants who are not healthcare providers. What lesson do we take from that when we think about innovation and infrastructure and ecosystem? Are there any other glass walls we need to break in order to truly drive change?
I'll jump in and say, I agree with that. I think it's fascinating, the whole discussion that we heard before the vaccine, so-called vaccine passports about privacy, et cetera, has seemingly vanished. I think about it more from the perspective of technology where I live. And I think it's fascinating and exciting, some of the things we're seeing. If you look at what actually underlies Accelera, a company in Vancouver that is a hugely successful Canadian company today and has developed some of the underlying technology in one of the COVID therapies, they are dramatically reducing the time of the drug development process. And as we all know, it takes 10 years and $1 billion plus or minus, depends on who you believe. It could be a couple of billion. It's an expensive process. So to reduce that is pretty impressive. The other thing I'd say is that the Acuitas technology that I think Pamela referenced, it might have been Kathy, I forget earlier, that again is part of delivering mRNA technology is the reflection of 25 or 30 years of Canadian research spending. Right. And that's really important to understand that those, as much as we can see technology shortening the time of development, like I cited with Acceleron, it's still a process that requires substantive investment in basic research.
Kathy and Mostafa, the other sort of theme in here is around, so innovation is one side that I think was not necessarily accessible to everyone in the common. What does it mean wasn't accessible? The other side of healthcare that I think is more understandable by Canadians today is the importance of rehabilitation, the importance of the care part of healthcare, right? The elongated process. We saw that with seniors, we saw that with aging in place. There's a question here about long haul COVID patients where we were not sure what the long-term effects of this illness might look like, and is our system prepared to do that? How do we invest in spaces where we're not quite sure like what the end point of the care model looks like? Is that a safe investment? Is it something we should be putting money against? And to Gordon's earlier comment, how do you make those kinds of trade-offs, if at all, versus immediate return versus a bet really in the care model?
Let me think
come back for a second to the virtual care, because I think we all see that there are really new ways of doing things. So it's somewhat of a broader answer to the question. But I think there are still parts of the old model that have to be fixed. And I'm not talking about fax machines in hospitals and in doctors' offices, but for example, there are parts of Canada that don't have fee codes in place permanently for virtual consultations. So while it was put in place during COVID, those are things that we need to look at if we really do want to continue to work with these more effective, more efficient models of care. And the same thing with ownership of data. I mean, today it's the healthcare professionals who are really the custodians of the data. The patients have to be put in the center of this. So I think, yes, the innovation and new ways of doing things, new operating models, all that needs to be thrown in the mix. It's not enough to say that we've got this wonderful technology, because there's a lot of pieces around governance of the data, around ownership of the data, around privacy laws, that haven't been thought through completely. And I don't think we'll be able to fully leverage what technology is able to bring us in terms of a new future in healthcare.
Thanks, Kathy. Mostafa?
Can I just add something both on innovation technology and the impact on the healthcare system? I've been doing this work for a long time, looking at healthcare expenses essentially by provincial government, and what are the drivers for that. And one of the things we have noticed in our work and over the years, not only here, previously when I was at Health Canada and Department of Finance, that while technology and innovation actually improve the quality of health care, at the same time, they increase the cost of healthcare. Because what happens is that new treatment, new drugs become more expensive and are more expensive, because obviously those who have to provide those have invested a lot of money, so they have to recoup their investment. But what we see is that actually increases the cost of healthcare, because everybody demands that, right? I mean, we have a public healthcare system, people don't pay for it, so they demand the latest technology, the latest treatment. So that's a challenge for especially for provinces, that they have to pay for it. And so it's again something that has to be taken into account when we talk about technology and innovation and the impact on the healthcare system.
But isn't it the case, Mostafa, that is a reflection of an established system not fully engaging with those technological changes? So for example, we use the family physician as a gatekeeper for the system, so that when you provide for virtual care, the amount of care goes up dramatically because people can reach their physician more easily. Doesn't it really say that we need to think about the whole system and think about how we make it more efficient and force it to adopt technology so that those incentives exist?
Absolutely. I mean, you're right. Definitely, the healthcare system itself requires significant changes. I don't have any doubt about it. The question is that the Canada Health Act has been around for a long time, and nobody dares to touch it. because politically it's extremely difficult to do that. But if there is demand there, if people actually request that, there are things that you can do in the healthcare system in the Canada Health Act that will actually improve the system significantly. But it's a challenge. That's a political challenge that unfortunately our federation has not been able to actually tackle that.
Good exchange. I was just watching this. I mean, this is a real panel. Like, there's actual perspective, which is great. We have a few minutes left, so I'm going to give you each 30 seconds for a closing thought, and then we will end the panel. This has been very, very informative. Gordon, I'll start with you for closing thoughts.
So thank you for the opportunity. Let me just say, I think this is a very exciting time for life sciences. If we continue to collaborate and pull together the way that we have through the pandemic, there is a extraordinary opportunity for Canada to lead the world in life sciences. We have the research infrastructure to do that. We're seeing the emergence of the biotechnology industry as a sustainable force in Canada. And if we focus on the whole continuum of development and care, the future belongs to Canada.
Mostafa?
Yeah, maybe one thing I would say, I mean, I agree with the points that have been made on the importance of life science and the need for more investment. One thing what I'm afraid of is that there's a lot of talk about self-sufficiency because of the pandemic. All countries are doing this. And my hope is that does not lead to a sort of the protection system that would not allow countries to actually deal with each other and stop the trade of knowledge and trade of goods and services. Because whatever we do, we need to work with other countries. We need to trade. It doesn't matter. We may not have all the expertise and skills here in Canada. Some others may have it. We need to be able to trade those skills and goods and services. So I hope this idea of the pandemic does not lead to a system that is more protectionist. That's really my message.
100%.
Final thought to Kathy.
I'll say 3 words. I think during the pandemic, we were creative, pragmatic, and collaborative. And I think if we could keep those in mind moving forward, then I think, we'll really move the needle and continue to build out a life sciences sector and a healthcare sector that really puts the patient at the center of the care.
Great way to end it. We need to put the patient at the center of care. Kathy, Gordon, Mostafa, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your perspective. Thank you to the Walrus and Pamela and IMC for bringing us together. Look forward to the next time, hopefully in person, somewhere across our beautiful country. Back to you, Jennifer.
You're welcome.
Yes, absolutely. Looking forward to in-person events ahead. Thank you again, David. Thank you, Mostafa Askari, Catherine Megyery, Gordon McCauley, Pamela Fralick, and everyone at Innovative Medicines Canada for making this conversation possible. I'd also like to thank our annual sponsors, Air Canada, Inspire, Labatt Breweries of Canada, Meta, and Shaw. And thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed today's event, we have more coming up. Check in at thewalrus.ca/events. That's where we post our schedule. We also will be posting the video from this event, and you can explore all our videos in the Walrus Talks video room on our website. Keep an eye on your inbox. We will send you an email as a follow-up. And the best way to stay in touch with us and not miss a single event is to opt in to our newsletter. We'll also include a link in that email to our cover story, Virtual Healthcare, very much getting into some of the conversation we just heard now. At the Walrus, we believe you need trustworthy journalism, and trustworthy journalism needs you. If you enjoyed this free event, please consider making a donation by visiting thewalrus.ca/donate. All donations, $20 or more, will receive a charitable tax receipt. We talked a lot about COVID today, and community is really important in these COVID times. Each one of you is part of the Walrus. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to staying in touch.